Episode 285, Working Across 4 Microclimates. This is The Change Underground. I'm your host, John Moore. Decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. Summer is ramping up here in the northwest of Tasmania. Our homelands are at 350 metres above sea level. The land at work is at 150 and very exposed to the sea breezes and the usual roaring 40s trade winds that all of Tas benefits from. If we toss in the glasshouse and the two polytunnels, and I'm basically dealing with 4 microclimates at once. Here, outside at work, the glasshouse and the polytunnels. Now when I say glasshouse, half the roof is solid sheets and half a see-through sheet. As a result of somewhat lower light levels, plants tend to grow very leggy, stretched out looking for more light. They are nonetheless very productive. The polytunnels, and these are the first ones I've worked with, are booming and blooming. A quarter of one we've put down to a tall flower mix, which really took off and is now being allowed to run to seed so it can be self-sustaining. To the north of these flowers and covering both sides of the polytunnel are some sweet corn, which is now starting to produce cobs of an edible nature, which is quite early for that part of the world. Now maize is best planted in blocks as it's wind pollinated, and the sprays at the top of the plants give off the pollen, and the silks hanging at the top of the cobs represent the female parts. Each line of silk needs to be pollinated by pollen, obviously, but from a different plant in the stand as the species as each plant is self-infertile. Not a problem in a block planted outside in the wind. In the polytunnel, breezes do not flow so well, but not that effectively to achieve pollination. So I've been shaking the plants twice a week to spread the pollen about. It seems to have worked in most cases, but we have maybe 30% where kernel formation is not 100%, but the rest are, so we're doing all right. And the great advantage of growing maize in the tunnel is the earliness of the harvest. And while we have a semi-control space, I've tried a couple of experiments. Whilst the maize was small, sort of 2 to 4 leaf stage or thereabouts, on the left-hand side, or the western side, I guess, of that polytunnel, we planted radish between the rows, because there's 2 rows on either side. And on the right-hand side, I planted climbing beans, which have climbed the corn stalks, and they don't seem to be doing any damage, but actually adding to the productivity. And this represents 2 of the 3 sisters, of course, of the Native American growing system of the same name. Now opposite the tall flower mix, as we come back down the polytunnel, and behind the corn bean mix, we've planted Jack B. Little variety pumpkins. These will be planted amongst the corn bean mix next year, and will be the 3rd sister in the system. And there's a link to the 3 Sisters garden in the show. Down the left-hand side of the second polytunnel, that is, again, the western side, are purple king beans and some long pod beans. And both of these are bush beans. And on the right-hand side, we've got broccoli, zucchini, tomatoes and oregano. And everything's just booming. It's really rather pleasant to see. We just have to keep the water up to it because it gets awfully hot in those tunnels. And obviously, they're not going to get much rain. Now, the outside gardening area has undergone a number of changes in the last 12 months. Originally a series of timber-edged raised beds with carpet offcuts as pathways, the place had become overgrown with perennial grasses and other weeds, and a 1.5 year lockdown and then 1 rostered day a week, it really wasn't possible to keep on top of it. So it was time to start again. It took myself and the clients about a month to clear the area off, which then became overgrown with mustard weed and the same grasses. And we kept slashing this to get some organic matter into the soil. Eventually some funding was found to get the place in shape. 4 full days on my own, which was very good for the soul, had 10 beds ready to plant. Then everything stopped again as a 12-week intro to horticulture program was pushed back until late October. And that was 1 day a week. And the first 6 weeks of that program were wet, and the clients attending had conditions where I wasn't prepared to have them drenched to the skin. So it wasn't until late December that we were able to get anything in, and that turned out to be another patch of sweet corn. When this has reached about knee high, more funding arrived, and funding for a chook house, in fact. So I pushed for mobile, but to no avail. The next best I could wrangle was a fixed coop with 4 runs. That way we can rotate the hens across the runs and grow veggies in the other 3 that the chooks aren't in. And of course 2 of the runs will be over the top of the corn. So we should be able to get the fencing in place without overly disturbing the crop, but who knows what's coming next. I am at the point where I am just along for the ride, doing what I can in the full realisation I have very little control over what's going on. As a grower of food in the real world, very little control over what's going on, especially with the weather, is actually a baseline assumption. So things are happening at work, mostly good, some frustrating and occasionally wasteful, but as Ned Kelly allegedly said on the scaffold, such is life. On the home front, I put in a minimum tillage sweep over the barley and oat stubble and broadcast buckwheat. I had enough seed left over to broadcast over the spelt stubble, which I hadn't turned under. And it will be interesting to see if the minimum tillage was necessary or not. I sowed buckwheat at this time because we were forecast 20 to 40 mils of rain in the next 24 hours. As an added safety measure, in inverted commas, to protect the seeds from birds, I mixed 50 grams of cayenne pepper in with 2 kilos of buckwheat seed. Now here comes a very big lesson that I've learnt and would not want any of you to go through. As the rain was on its way, the breeze was picking up whilst I was using the seed spinner to broadcast the buckwheat. Cayenne pepper particles are much lighter than buckwheat seeds. So basically I was tear gassing myself while broadcasting the buckwheat. Not all at once, and only when the wind was into my face and some of the cayenne hadn't been thoroughly spread through the seeds. But lesson learnt, painful lesson learnt. It's a bit funny to think about now, but definitely was not at the time. I have another 12 kilos of buckwheat to sow over the next few weeks or so, before sourcing some white clover to follow the buckwheat. It's both a cover crop and nitrogen supply for next summer's blue corn. The plan is to cut 20 centimetre strips a metre apart through the white clover for planting the corn. Now as the corn grows, it shades out the clover, which dies back, releasing nitrogen. And once the corn is harvested, the clover grows back. But I'd like to add a buckwheat crop in between the summer corn and the winter white clover by broadcasting that into the spaces between the clover after the corn harvest, doubling maybe the mass of plant material covering the ground. Grasses do grow through the clover, so maybe a winter spelt crop instead of the short buckwheat, but who's to know? I'm happy to be getting the buckwheat in, and I'll contemplate other options as the time comes. I really do enjoy the thought process required to work out these rotations. The do we really need to rotate crops question has been on my mind for a while, and we shall see, I guess. The thinking, the problem solving, the adaptation to just what nature is throwing our way is as satisfying for me in a way as the actual growing and harvesting. And maybe that's something that drives you too. This is the last episode of my 6th year in this podcast feed. The 1st of February 2016 was when I kicked off the show. Looking forward to our 7th year together. Both those who have travelled with me for the entire journey and all of you who have joined along the way. And you know the drill. If you need help, there's a free ebook over at World Organic News at the website. And there's the no-dig gardening course there too as well. Links in the show notes. Decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. Thank you all for listening, and I'll be back next week into our 7th year.